The President's remarks at the Symposium on Economic Growth of the American Bankers Association, from the Grand Ballroom of the Mayflower Hotel in Washington, D.C., February 25th, 1963.
Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Secretary, Dr. Heller, Dr. Jfk'S, gentlemen. 100 years ago, today, in the darkest domestic crisis that this nation has ever known, the national banking system was founded. It was a far-sighted act and has provided for a sound basis for the extraordinary economic expansion which has brought the United States to its present unrivaled position. Today, many Americans tend to think of developing underdeveloped countries in terms only of faraway nations. But in 1863, even measured by 1963 dollars, our own per capita income, and this should be a source of encouragement to many who are laboring with the problem of underdevelopment in far-off countries, our own per capita income was less than $1 a day, approximately the same as Chile's. Nearly 60% of our labor force was engaged in agriculture, the same percentage as is today engaged in the Philippines. An estimated 20% of our population was illiterate, the same percentage of the population of Ceylon. Only 1/5 of our 34 million people lived in towns or cities of over 5,000 in population, as is roughly true now of Turkey. In 1863, this nation had fewer railroad tracks laid than India has today, and its children had a shorter life expectancy than a child born this year in Thailand or Zanzibar. What can be summed up in that past 100 years? I think the history of it can be summed up in 2 words, and that is economic growth. No nation in the history of the world has ever experienced a century of economic growth comparable to that of the United States in the last 100 years. In 100 years, the growth of our free enterprise economy under a free political system and under the development effectively of our national and local and state educational systems has brought our citizens to an unprecedented standard of living. It has brought to our nation an unparalleled position in the world as the world's foremost banker, merchant, manufacturer, and consumer. It has demonstrated the power of freedom for all to see and sustained the cause of freedom through hot wars and cold, at home and abroad. All this and more has been made possible by economic growth. And yet we've heard in recent times that economic growth is too abstract a concept, that it's too academic for politicians and voters, that it's too theoretical a basis for proposals to the Congress. I do not see anything abstract or academic about economic growth. It means finding 1,200,000 additional jobs every year for the men and women pouring into our labor market, half of them below the age of 25. It means preventing the periodic recessions which have hit our nations 3 times in the last 10 years. It means ending the persisting slack which has kept our unemployment rate at 5% or above for 62 out of the last 63 months, kept output $30 to $40 billion below our productive capacity, and kept corporate investment in 1962 actually below the levels of gross retained earnings. There's nothing theoretical about that. There's nothing academic about pushing our economy to 4% instead of 3%, which might total over the next 10 years, in today's prices, $400 billion more in outputs of goods and services, with all that this would mean to family incomes, wages, profits, and governmental revenues. These are the concrete, not abstract figures that growth represents. And that is why I'm pleased that the American Bankers Association has devoted this conference to that subject. And that's why I believe the most urgent piece of business before the Congress this year is federal tax revision. Last year, a year of recovery and prosperity for most Americans, unemployment averaged the same high 5.6% of the labor force as it did in the recession year of 1954. Business spending on new plant and equipment was at a lower level last year than it was in 1957, though total output and profits were much higher. These are deeply disturbing statistics, and yet there is nothing deeply wrong with our economy. We have the most productive, skilled workers in the world and the most ample natural resources and a respected currency. We have no lack of savings or technicians or mass markets or price stability, such as hampers economic progress in so much of the world today. We have, in short, no basic obstacles to growth, and we have opportunities for greater growth. I do not believe that any thoughtful American could look at the statistics and impartial facts about this nation's economy over that period and not conclude that we need to step up our growth. But it will not be stepped up by political slogans or homely analogies. It will not be stepped up by canceling defense contracts or lowering the debt ceiling. In my opinion, it will be stepped up only by lightening the repressive weight of wartime tax rates, which put a damper on private purchasing power and profits. The tax program I have put forward to meet this need is now under attack from the left and the right. I do not say it's a perfect program which cannot be changed by the Congress and will not be changed by the Congress, or which will satisfy the desires of all groups, or which will achieve all the growth we need as fast as we need it. But those who admit the problem but oppose the proposed solution of a $10 billion top-to-bottom tax revision are under some obligation to put forward some proposals of their own. Would they expect the Congress to accept instead a $10 billion increase in federal spending or a $20 billion federal deficit? Would they propose instead a $10 billion injection of credit at lower rates of interest without regard to the balance of payments? At a time of record profits, would they increase tax reductions solely for corporations or investors who received a $2.5 billion tax cut last year and thereby attempt to stimulate new capacity without increasing the purchasing power of the American consumer, who cannot afford to buy enough now to make use of our existing capacity? Do they feel that tax concessions, loopholes, and deductions are preferable to lower tax rates as a spur to economic growth? These are the questions which must be answered if we Americans mean business about boosting American business. Tax reduction will not be passed if each group continues to treat growth as a crop to be divided, or if each group examines what is available through the wrong end of the telescope. Of course, if the low-income man looks at the dollar amounts of the cut, he will decide the rich are getting all the breaks. And if the high income looks at the percentage cuts, he will decide the opposite. And meanwhile, those in the middle, hearing all this, will be convinced that they will get less than either the rich or the poor. The facts of the matter are that the reduction is fairly distributed through all income brackets. And I would hope that all groups would put national interest first and recognize that the prospects for tax reduction and economic growth must not be endangered by squabbles over who's going to get what. For it is the nation that will benefit most from the passage of the program, and the nation that will suffer, and all the people who make up the nation, if the program is defeated. The tax program we have submitted is, in fact, consistent with all legitimate ends. It is designed to expand demand among both investors and consumers, to boost the economy in both the short run and the long run, and to achieve in time both a balanced, full employment economy and a balanced federal budget. Heated talk about budget increases should not obscure the fact that civilian expenditures under the proposed budget will be decreased, an accomplishment which has occurred only 4 times in the last 15 years. Partisan talk about swollen federal payrolls should not obscure the fact that this budget calls for fewer federal employees to serve every 100 people in this country than there were only a few years ago. Exasperated talk about increasing the deficit should not obscure the fact that the enactment of the proposed tax program would add only $2.7 billion to next year's deficit. But if we slide into another recession, pulling annual gross national product down by as little as 3%, the deficit would be increased twice as much. In other words, the deficit without a tax cut would then be far higher than the projected deficit we face with a tax cut, higher even than the record deficit of $12.4 billion, which followed the recession of 1958, only a few months after the President of the United States had submitted a budget which provided for a surplus of $500 million. That's how quickly a deficit can unbalance a budget. I'm not predicting a recession for '63, but we cannot escape the fact that the period of expansion between the first and second post-war recession lasted 45 months. The period between the second and the third lasted 35 months. The period between the third and the fourth lasted 25 months, and the American economy is now in its 24th month of recovery from the fourth post-war recession. Finally, rash talk about a crushing debt burden should not obscure the fact that by every meaningful measure, that burden under the proposed budget and tax cut will actually decline. It is true that our current national debt would be a crushing burden for an economy less vigorous than ours. It would have been a crushing burden for the United States economy in 1923 or 1863. But as a proportion of our gross national product, our debt burden is not only manageable, but is steadily declining. Its weight as a proportion of our gross national product has been cut more than in half since 1947, and it will continue to fall in the years ahead. Bankers understand better than most people that a debt prudently undertaken for gainful purposes by one whose income is capable of carrying it can greatly strengthen the debtor. Corporate debt has increased over 200% in the last 15 years, compared to an increase in the federal debt of 15%. Not because our business enterprises are wasteful or irresponsible or swollen or profligate, but because they believe in growth. A transitional federal deficit now, as the result of a tax cut, reflects a prudent investment in this nation's future growth. But the chronic deficits produced by a lagging economy and the record deficit produced by a new recession would surely increase the real burden of any debt and set back that future growth. Let me make clear the framework of fiscal prudence and economic necessity in which this tax program is submitted by making the following predictions and pledges if the full tax reduction program I'm submitted is enacted this year. First, that this program will in a short time result in increased tax revenues, as did the 1954 tax cut. And a substantial portion of that increase will be used each year to reduce the deficit until the budget is once again balanced. Second, that any increases in the federal debt resulting from these transitional budget deficits will be kept proportionately lower than the increase in our gross national product, and thus the real burden of the federal debt can be reduced. Third, that any necessary increases in federal employment will be kept proportionately lower than the increase in the national population, the increase in state and local government employment, and through efficiencies in management and operation, the increase in the federal workload required to serve the nation. Fourth, that every effort will be made to continue the present downward trend in our balance of payment deficit and the present stable levels of our wholesale and consumer prices, levels more stable in the past 2 years, in fact, than any major industrialized country with the sole exception of Canada. As one of your distinguished guests here this morning, Dr. Jfk'S, has said, our problem since 1959, in his speech he made in that year prophesying that the end of the great inflationary spiral had come about at a time when most of us were still talking about the dangers of inflation in 59, 60, 61, and even in 62. Our problem is not inflation, providing we use prudence in the management of our wages and prices and in our monetary policy. Our problem is to maintain our economy against the pressures of deflation in the free world. Fifth, that no budget will be submitted by this administration which does not continue a persistent and surprisingly unpopular program of cutting costs, increasing efficiency, and weeding out obsolete activities. I realize that all such economic prophecies and commitments in these times are subject to being displaced by national and international crises. But subject to the same allowances, if no tax cut is enacted, I would be willing to venture a wholly different set of predictions. First, that tax revenues will continue year in and year out to be insufficient to balance the budget, no matter how tightly the administration and Congress control expenditures. Second, that the country will, in the not too distant future, be struck by its fifth post-war recession, with a heavy loss of jobs and profits, a record-breaking budget deficit, and an increased burden of national debt. Third, that unemployment and unused business capacity will remain at or above their present high levels, creating a lack of investor confidence at home and a lack of confidence in the dollar abroad. Fourth, that the pressure for a 35-hour week, for restrictions on imports and automation, and for large quickie tax cuts and sharply increased federal spending will all grow beyond manageable limits. Fifth, that this nation's rate of economic growth will not match over the next 10 years the record of most other industrial powers or our own record in this century. I hope the members of this association and the delegates to this conference on growth will carefully weigh these alternate set of predictions. If the first set is borne out by the facts, we will have established in this country a brisk climate for business investment and confidence. But if the second is set upon us by the failure of the Congress to enact an adequate tax program this year, the consequences will be with us for some years to come. This symposium, I know, is dedicated to the proposition that such serious issues must not be decided by rules of party politics, public opinion polls, and prejudice. Your awareness of the facts and the alternatives uniquely enables you to bring objectivity and reality to a discussion now too often obscured by superficial details and too often conflicting claims and interests. As bankers who lend to both consumers and investors, to both management and labor, to rich and to poor, to middle-income groups, you recognize the needs of all. For you have witnessed in your own enterprises that the businessman's greatest need is new market demand, and the wage earner's greatest need is expanding business activity. The nation's greatest need is a tax bill that will help fulfill both of these objectives. Tax revision, may I say in conclusion, is not the only ingredient in a policy for growth. Education, I would certainly put up near the top of those things which, if well invested in, can provide a substantial return. An investment in education yields a substantial return in new research, new products, new techniques, in higher wages and purchasing power, and a greater supply of college-trained manpower. Unfortunately, a staggering 40% of all young people are dropping out before graduating from high school. Only 16% are completing college, and only about 1/2% are achieving the PhD degrees upon which the advance of knowledge depends. We must improve the quantity and the quality of our education if we are to have growth. There are other steps we must take if we are to step up economic growth, to improve the knowledge and mobility of our labor force, to encourage the development of new technology, to support the growth of basic science, to make the most of our natural resources. But today there is no more single, fruitful, or urgent business than tax revision, in the interests of fiscal responsibility, equity, and efficiency, but above all, in the interests of the United States in 1963. Thank you.